Diane Marie Pinderhughes, the Reverend Edmund He Joyce, CSC, Professor of Africana Studies and Political Science at the University of Notre Dame.
Thank you. So Dr. Pinderhughes, can you tell us a little bit about your personal background, specifically where you're from, what was your home and family life like when you were growing up?
I was born in Washington, D.C. I'm a native of Washington, as was my mother. My father grew up in another state, but I was born there and grew up there. My home life was, I was an early part of the baby boom right after World War II. My parents had been married at the beginning of the war, and after my father came home from the war, they began to have children. Myself, my sister, Gail. We arrived in 1947 and 1948. We lived in Southeast Washington, across from Capitol Hill, not too far from Capitol Hill, literally up the hill from the Frederick Douglass, what became the National Historic Site. It wasn't when we were little. It's a very quiet neighborhood at that point. It was housing that was built right after World War II, and we walked up to school, the elementary school at Our Lady of Perpetual Help Elementary School, which overlooked Washington, all of Washington. You could see the Capitol, the National Airport, and lots of DC.
Thank you. How were you introduced to the field of political science?
Well, I would say when I was in college at Albertus Magnus College in New Haven, Connecticut, one of my advisors was Larry DeNardis, who was a political actor. He eventually ran for the Senate in Connecticut, and he was working on his dissertation. He eventually ran for Congress, but when I was in college, he was in the Senate in Connecticut. And I was interested in politics, had been from when I was a child and would read the paper on a daily basis. So when I got to college, I was interested in journalism, poli-sci, settled on my small women's college didn't have a journalism program or department, and so I was interested in political science. And that was small because he was the only faculty member. And the other person who taught us was Rosa DeLauro, who was a visiting faculty member who taught for, like one course on comparative politics. And then eventually her father was in politics in Connecticut. And when Larry DeNardis was elected to Congress in 1980, and then he was pushed out in the midterm elections in 82, I think she might have been elected right at that point, Rosa DeLauro, and she's been in office, of course, ever since.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Mm-hmm.
So you mentioned that you went to undergrad at
Albertus Magnus College.
Albertus Magnus College, and where did you go to graduate school?
I went to graduate school at the University of Chicago in political science.
Okay, thank you. Were you a first-generation scholar?
I was not. My father had been in college. He did not finish college. He was in college in the middle of the Great Depression, but he went to about 2.5 years of college at what was then called Rhode Island State, now called University of Rhode Island. His parents had, of course, wanted him to go to college, but at the point when the money began to get scarce, and the person who had employed my grandfather, he was a driver, a chauffeur for wealthy people in Rhode Island. He when he died, he was supposed to provide the money for my father to continue to go to college. But when he died, his wife did not sustain that contribution, so he had to drop out of college. But in other words, he had a college education. He'd been majoring in agriculture in Rhode Island, but it meant that he was beyond. He grew up in Providence, Rhode Island. He had an education beyond high school.
Thank you. Can you tell us a little bit about your undergraduate and your graduate school experience?
My undergraduate experience, and then I'll talk about my graduate school experience. My undergraduate experience Catholic Women's College at the time. It's now co-ed, and was oriented towards being a kind of Catholic Seven Sisters school. A lot of the people who went there were, everybody was Catholic, but they were also ethnic Italian, Polish, Irish students, and wanted, it was like a school that wanted to be the equivalent of Wellesley or Smith and so forth, and was in New Haven, Connecticut. So Yale was just down the street. So a lot of people aimed at, dating or marrying people from Yale. So my experience in college was different. It was really interesting in the sense of it being a different place than I'd grown up in. I went from Washington, D.C. to New England, not northern New England, but southern New England. My grandmother was still alive, and she was in Providence. My uncle was there. Two uncles were in Providence. So it wasn't a long way out of the realm of my personal experience. But also being in New Haven and being able to go to events at Yale and knowing the politics that was going on at the time, there was a lot of, by my junior year, I think the Black Panthers were very active and there was a lot of protests going on. The Vietnam War was happening. The Biafran War was happening also during those years. And, you'd go to Yale to hear various people talk or hear lectures and have a social life that involved Yale as well. So when I started graduate school, it was an interesting time to enter because there were, when I say we, I'm thinking of a number of people I met in graduate school with whom I interact to this day. Lorenzo Morris was in his second year of graduate school. The year that I entered, Toni Michelle Travis entered as well. Charles Henry entered as well. There were a number of others as well, and people who came a year or two after me. Deborah Lee, who's now Deborah Lee Jones, joined the graduate program. John Hope Franklin was still teaching at that point, and so I had interactions with people not only in political science but also in history. Jenna Ray McNeil was a graduate student at the time and a historian who's very well known and published. Others who worked with John Hope Franklin, who a couple of years after we got there, I joined the graduate program in 1969. He retired from Chicago and moved to Duke University, where of course, would then come into contact with him many years later. But there were people there who, for example, Ida B. Wells' great-granddaughter was actually living and working in the area at that time and was working on a biography of her grandmother. And the people that you'd meet through political science, but also through history and so forth, you'd come into contact with those individuals. It was a very, very interesting space, with the university being set in the middle of Hyde Park, where there was always a lot going on.
Sounds like it. Did you have any mentors along the way that made an impression on you or on your career? If so, who?
Well, I really have to say that the numbers of people who entered graduate school or were there when I was starting became my mentors, or in a sense, as well as faculty. I've mentioned Lorenzo, Toni Michelle, Charles Henry, but there are also people like Robert Starks was somewhere around entered somewhere around the same time, as well as Peter Anyang Nyong'o, who finished the same year that I did, and is now a governor of Kisumu County in Kenya, and his daughter Lupita Nyong'o is an Oscar-winning actress. Marguerite Ross Barnett had just come back from her field work at the year that I entered. She was married to Stephen Barnett, and their daughter Amy was a babe not in arms, but in the crib, for whom I babysat from time to time. She's now active in entertainment and lives in Los Angeles. But Marguerite she was finishing her dissertation at Chicago and eventually went to Princeton to teach, where she did not get tenure, but then joined the faculty at Howard University. So Marguerite she taught a course on urban politics. Tony was in that class, I was in the class, Lorenzo might have been in the class. And she was a really brilliant woman, absolutely brilliant woman, with whom I became friends, and who was someone whose advice I sought for the rest of her life. She lived to be about 49 or so, and passed away in about 1991 or so. But she'd had a wonderful career as a faculty member at Princeton. I mentioned that. Then went to Howard, then to City University of New York, Columbia University, then to City University of New York, where she was vice chancellor for academic affairs, and then moved to become president at University of Missouri St. Louis, and then to University of Houston, where she was her last appointment. So she was a very, very important mentor. But the faculty, or the graduate students with whom I worked, and whose interests were similar to mine, have been important for most of my career. There's another group of women faculty, or now faculty, who were grad students at the same time. Christy Anderson, Kay Lehman Schlossman, Christy Monroe, are all faculty at various places. Judy Fines was a graduate student. She finished, but she didn't teach. She became a professional advisor or scholar in a consulting firm based in Boston. So that was a group of people with whom I actually am still in contact and with whom I interact with some degree of frequency.
Thank you. You did allude to this earlier, but here's a follow-up question on it. How would you characterize the socio-political environment in the U.S. while you were in college or in graduate school? And were you involved in social or political activism as a student?
It was quite a volatile time. There was a lot of protest going on. So I was in college from 65 to 69, which spans the end of the Civil Rights Movement, the Vietnam War, lots of protests, lots of feminist activity. At my college, we engaged in some of our protests, I guess you'd have to say, was feminist. As such, we didn't define it that way. People didn't necessarily use those terms, but we wanted a little more flexibility in our lives. And so at the time, there were significant limitations on our time, what the visiting hours for guests would be, what we were supposed to be wearing or not wearing. You weren't supposed to wear pants. What you could wear was very strongly constrained by the norms of the college. So we decided we would protest, and engaged in protest about being able to wear pants we wanted to. We didn't have to, wear. If we wanted to wear pants, we could go out and wear pants. We could stay out a little bit late. This had started, ironically enough, when one October, around Thanksgiving, but we decided we were living in Trinity dorm, which was just outside the walls of Alberta. So there's a main campus with walls around it, and we were outside, and we decided we would nail a statement on the door of our dorm, as in Martin Luther and nailing those theses on the door of a cathedral in Germany. And we were being taught by a grad student from Yale who was interested in and was teaching us a course on religion. I'm sure they didn't hire him again after that, because we we were inspired by his comments. We decided, okay, we're gonna use this to make a challenge to the status quo. And the strike went on long enough that the student leadership, was the president of the student body and so forth, were suspended. And the nuns were, this is an order of nuns called the Dominicans, they were not, to say the least, happy about this. But when they suspended this group of the official student leaders, then another set of people said, okay, we were negotiating, what were you talking about? And it continued, and they eventually had to kind of just give up and say, okay. I like to claim that that change, they're having to adapt to that, enable them to think about how to run a university or how to run a college differently than they'd been running it before. And they became, I think that the college became much more flexible. So it had been a women's college founded in about 1925, so we're just coming up on its centennial. And they decided, at some point, they decided to go co-ed. They began to admit many more students of color, black students, Latino students. You know, when you look at that website, it's a very, very different place than when I went to college. And it survived. Many Catholic women's colleges, many women's colleges did not survive because they didn't know how to change. They didn't want to change. I think this one was able to do that. The president at the time of some of that change was able, and this person just stepped down maybe within the last 5 to 7 years. She had been a nun when it started, when she started as president, and she decided to stop being a nun at some point, but she continued as president. I teach at the University of Notre Dame at present, and the only president of the University of Notre Dame can be a priest of the Order of Holy Cross, and no one else can be president. Albertus, they were able to tolerate a nun who decided she didn't want to be a nun any longer, but she was still president. So flexibility at the leadership level, flexibility in the character of the institution, and so it survived. It's now, the current president is a man, and I think they're doing fairly well.
Thank you. Can you tell us a bit about your research trajectory? For example, what was your dissertation topic? What is your current main area of focus? And were there any particular scholars whose work was influential to you?
My dissertation research was on a comparison of racial and ethnic politics in Chicago, early 20th century Chicago, between 1910 and 1940. And I had decided to focus on, I selected African Americans to begin with, but I also wanted to look at what the experience of initial political participation for Poles and Italians. Now, I selected Poles and Italians because I wanted to be able to look at groups that entered the U.S. who entered the U.S. around the same time as African Americans began to migrate in large numbers from the South to Chicago. So my dissertation research involved a comparison of the experiences of those three groups. And I looked at their cultural experience. I looked at a couple of policy areas, education and criminal justice. And I looked at their beginning to enter into voting and to electing people to office. And so African Americans were able to be relatively successful in terms of electing people in the early 20th century, that is the 10 to 40 period, where they began to elect people to the city council. At the time that I was finishing my dissertation, when my book was being turned from a dissertation into a book, Harold Washington was beginning to rise in the period from, the book was published in 87, and he was already in the Illinois House and then the Senate. Then he got elected to Congress in about 81, and then was elected mayor in 83. So looking at what was happening in the early part of the century, and then at the same time as I was revising the book for publication and seeing what was happening 40, 50 years later, was a fascinating experience. So my dissertation research was prompted by my experience of growing up in Washington and seeing and being frustrated by the not being able to have direct voting rights at the time. And I was interested in what that experience was like in Chicago, where despite the fact that blacks had the right to vote and they had elected people to office, it was still a problematic political environment. So it allowed me the opportunity to look back at the founding years of 20th century founding years of political participation, and to see the challenges and the weaknesses of that system in Chicago as well as in Washington, but then also to see how European ethnic groups were able to do in that respect. So it was a enjoyable dissertation. I enjoyed doing that, and then turning it into my book on racial and ethnic politics in Chicago.
Wonderful. What is your current main area of research focus?
I'm currently the Mellon Fellow at the Center for Advanced Studies in Behavioral Sciences at Stanford University. And my research focus is on voting rights issues and the challenges of continuing to improve, and we're finding, it's not exactly improving at the current time period because of the dramatic changes in politics after the Obama administration, where Donald Trump was elected, and the ability to push back in terms of voting has been something that Black, Latino, Asian American organizations have been struggling with. So I'm trying to understand the possibilities of reform and the likelihood or the possibility of not being able to continue to reform voting participation. So it's a frustrating project because I've been working on it for some years with the expectation that we would have a successful result. And what this fellowship allowed me to do was to think about the possibility that it won't be successful. So I'm contemplating the challenges and the difficulties of political participation and success among African Americans and people of color as they seek to enter and stay involved in political participation.
Very interesting work. Are there any scholars in particular whose work has been influential to your own thinking and your own research?
Well, I think I've already mentioned Marguerite Ross Barnett, her founding, her work on politics. I mean, her dissertation was on cultural nationalism in South India. So very different than my research, but at the same time, she did some work in the mid-1970s. She co-edited a volume on public policy for the Black community, and her chapter on those issues outlines issues such as collective action, political participation, the ways in which African Americans might be successful in politics. I was influenced by Marguerite Ross Barnett, the course that I took with her when she was just out of the field, her writing on public policy for the Black community, her chapter within that, in which she talked about theoretical perspectives on African Americans, and her very thoughtful approaches to things I've used really throughout my career. I would say she introduced me to a lot of Weberian theory, and the notion of how groups possibly could change, and the Weberian categories. W.B. Du Bois, I think, was also a person whose work I first came to know through Margie Barnett, as I mostly called her. And the network of people that were at Chicago at the time was such a rich one that both my colleagues in poli-sci, but those people in history, sociology, William Julius Wilson was on my dissertation committee, for example. Ted Lowy was on the committee. He was on my master's committee, but Wilson was on my dissertation committee. Leonard Binder, who's now deceased, was on the dissertation committee. Not a Americanist, but was somebody who had worked with Marguerite, and a number of us began to work with him as a result of that. Paul Peterson was on the committee. J. David Greenstone was also there at the time, and Peterson and Greenstone worked on urban politics and so forth, and they were instructive and important, I think, in my introducing me to that work of urban areas, which was one of the elements of my own research, was urban politics. So, so Du Bois, Barnett, Greenstone, Peterson, Lowy, and the social science, deep social science areas have been important to me, and I am grateful for that.
Thank you for sharing that. We're going to shift gears a bit. I'd like to ask you, what does it mean to you to be a Black political scientist?
Yeah, every time I saw that question, I was like, what on earth am I going to say? I don't even know how to answer that question, but let's see if I can say something. Well, I think because of I'll go back now to my growing up years of being in Washington, D.C., and knowing that we were in an American democracy, but I was living in a city that was not democratic, and in which African Americans couldn't necessarily exercise their right to vote. They couldn't get the kinds of resources that were appropriate for them. It was a segregated city at that time. In my earliest years, the school system was segregated. My father worked in the post office. My mother was a housewife at the time. Till we were in maybe the end of our high school years. She then began to work in the Anacostia Community School Project. But knowing that race was an important, a very discriminatory element in the Washington area, it meant that when I began to think about college and think about, becoming a political science major, and then eventually my Larry Gianardis, I think, encouraged me to think about graduate school. And I think he was the one who mentioned University of Chicago. I didn't expect to be a faculty member or be an academic. I expected to come, after a couple of years, come home and work in the government. Toni Michelle Travis tells me that she encouraged me to think about staying in graduate school. Because I expected to get a master's and that would be it. And I remember J. David Greenstone encouraging me to stay, but Toni tells me she encouraged me to stay as well. Well, I believe her, and so I did stay. But it wasn't as if I had a vision of going into political science. But being a Washingtonian, being a person who'd been influenced by both parents' knowledge of discrimination and race and the things that they faced, it meant that I was interested in race for much of my career, and my work has oriented and moved in that direction. And it it meant that I didn't just go to Chicago and focus only on American politics as it was defined by the field at the time, but that I knew that I needed to come to meetings like this one, like the National Conference of Black Political Scientists. Lorenzo Morris, I think, knew about NCOPS, and he had been an undergraduate at Fisk University. And so I think my first time at NCOPS was at a Washington, D.C. meeting in about 1970. Marjorie Barnett was there also. She attended that meeting. A lot of the founders of NCOPS were there. It had only been founded about 1969, the year before. And so it means a lot in the sense that I can do the work that I'm interested in terms of politics and academic research. It means I can engage in professional development that gives me space to operate in NCOPS, but also in the American Political Science Association, that I can work with. I mean, I'm interested in group dynamics and cultural conflict, and some of that was part of what I was doing as a scholar, but also as a scholar who's part of a discipline in which those things were beginning to change in the 60s and early 70s.
Thank you. What challenges, if any, have you faced throughout your career, either due to race, gender, or your chosen field of study?
The challenges I faced in my career are many, and also, you know, I think about this issue of why, after, you know, having learned about the challenges that others faced, and I'm not saying I didn't face them, but I moved through them in a way that didn't end my career when I didn't get tenure at Dartmouth College. I was able to, I had a book I was working on. I went and got a postdoctoral fellowship from the Ford Foundation. Thank you, Ford. Also was able to go to UCLA with that fellowship, but also they had a fellowship in African American Studies. So it allowed me to go to Los Angeles, where it was warm that year. It's not been warm this year at Stanford. And to meet another set of people that have been an important part of my own intellectual life. I guess the challenges have been of some of the question of how do you respond when you have a challenge? What do you do when you don't get tenure? I was working on my book. There were a variety of problems in getting it published. Princeton turned it down. It was an odd thing, but it did get published by University of Illinois Press, which was a great press for it, given the fact it was about Chicago. It meant that I didn't get tenure at Dartmouth. I was able to get a job at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, where Michael Preston, a great urban politics scholar, was based. It meant I also got my fellowship that I took with me to UCLA. I figured out how to move through challenges in the sense of departments. You know, when I started teaching, Dartmouth had only gone co-ed in 1972. I arrived there in 75. I didn't understand how difficult that would be, but no one did at the time. Transitioning from being an all-male institution to being co-ed, not having many women faculty. You know, why I wouldn't think that it would be difficult, I don't know, but, you know, you're young and stupid, and so you just go ahead and do it, and you get your head knocked a bit, and then you just try to figure out how to do it a little bit differently and keep going. So some of the challenges included working at institutions where there had not been many women of color. There had not been many women. There had not been any women. There was one other woman in my department when I joined the faculty, Lynn Mather, who's also did criminal justice issues, and a couple of years younger than me, but was a year or two ahead of me in terms of getting tenure. And that there had not been another, I won't say there was not another person of color or black person who was tenure track. There was a black person who was a North African who was there, but didn't have a tenure track position, which means he didn't stay very long. One of my colleagues was Robert Nakamura, an Americanist from Berkeley, who we might have become on faculty members the same year. He also didn't get tenure, and ended up at SUNY Albany. So gender was an issue, race was an issue. Dartmouth did give tenure to a number of black males. They didn't do as good a job in terms of females. My sociology colleague, Deborah King, was there and did get tenure in sociology. She's done some really important work, but she's not been a full professor. But she's getting close to, I think will probably retire in another year or two, but a really important scholar in terms of not quite intersectionality, but she conceived of the notion of multiple jeopardy. It was the title of an important sociology article that she wrote that's similar to the intersectionality concept, and that was out around the same time as Kimberly Crenshaw at UCLA. So, yeah, there were a lot of challenges. But I guess I'm just kind of stubborn, and I didn't like to give up, and so I kept going.
Thank you. Just a few more questions. In your view, what is necessary in order to further diversify the discipline and make it more equitable and more welcoming?
Well, being willing to change intellectually, and by that I mean, the biggest field in terms of the American Political Science Association, the biggest field is American politics. And the way in which the field has developed over the last 30 years, the behavioral revolution, the emphasis on quantitative, the emphasis on increasingly modeling in various ways that don't allow the average graduate student to look at qualitative as well as quantitative work. And being willing to change that approach is part of what I think keeps the field very successful at reproducing generations of white scholars who are not especially interested in cultural dynamics, racial and ethnic politics, or anything outside of and this is a strong statement, I've started it, so I'll just go ahead and finish it, anything outside of the quantitative approach, the modeling approach, the mathematical approach to analysis. And the problem with that is the assumption that the American public life and political life is normed by what the large white population does and thinks. And to some extent that's true, but at the same time, it's not the only politics that there is. And our ability to understand that was challenged in the 1960s with civil rights protests, in 2020 with COVID and the racial reckoning and the George Floyd protests. You wouldn't have been able to predict that those things would change in the way that they have, based on the conventional ways in which American political science and American politics and the quantitative measures explain things. So it's quite it's very frustrating, but it's also a question as to whether it's possible because of the ways in which it's only if you get a person willing to look at the situation and say, okay, we're going to make changes. My current department chair at Notre Dame has been able to do that. Jeff Lehman has done a wonderful job of, we're going to look at these people that we're bringing in, we're going to think about how to incorporate more students of color in our program, and we're going to invite people to apply. We're going to see if they are interested in joining our faculty at Notre Dame. So when they finish their graduate program, they'll apply for positions. He moved in ways that others were not willing to do in the past. So I really appreciate that kind of change. But it doesn't happen all the time. It doesn't happen in every department. And it may not happen more than once or twice in the department that I'm currently in. So I don't know whether to say what we need is another crisis. We may need more crises to make those changes, to get there to be responsiveness.
Thank you. You have held and you continue to hold a number of important leadership positions in the profession, including being the former president of the APSA, the former president of INCOPES, and the current president of IPSA. What, in your view, makes a good leader?
Okay, that's another one of those tough questions. I guess I'd have to say a good leader is somebody who doesn't have enough sense to know when you should try to do things. Because there are often major challenges. There are things about the association you don't understand when you start, and you have to learn how that works, how the organization functions, and try to manage the learning process. So I guess I would say, a lot of people assume a good leader is somebody who's command and control. And I'm having to work through this issue right now with IPSA. That you are a leader if you can tell people what to do and lead through the struggle. But I find that you have to know how the association is designed, how it's developed, what its history is, what its ongoing instincts, I literally mean that, instincts are likely to be, given the way it's structured. And if you decide you're going to do something that pulls it away from its normal way in which it operates, and this is somewhat contradictory to what I was just saying, but still, you've got to take into account the way it's organized. And if you don't at least understand that, you may try to do things that will get you into a lot of difficulty and won't lead to the results that you would like. So I guess I would say a good leader is one who knows the political and social environment, knows the people in the leadership positions, knows the way the structure of the association encourages it to function, and then allows you to think about how to prompt it to change in some ways, but also not to assume that you can simply command the whole point about Eisenhower being a commander as president and having been a general during World War II, and he could command and people would pay no attention to him because the bureaucratic organizations function the way they function. So I would argue a leader is somebody who understands the limits of command and the ability to develop a strategy for helping the association move along, of working cooperatively. But the command approach is not one that's going to be successful, is what I would say.
Thank you. Do you have any advice for junior scholars coming up in the profession, especially those that might want to go into leadership positions?
I would encourage them to be active in organizations, to be active in INCOPES, to be active in the regional associations, to be active in the American Political Science Association, to think about the international ones. IPSA is International Political Science Association is one, But there are others, ECPR is another association that would be, I think, a good one for people to be involved in. And the reason I say that is because by being active, you learn a lot. You meet a lot of people. You meet a lot of people. You learn how the association functions. You learn about the resources that all these organizations have, the journals, the process by which people are able to make proposals, get their papers accepted or not accepted for conferences. You learn about intellectual resources. You learn and meet people across a lot of different types of universities, colleges, community colleges. You learn the strengths and weaknesses of academic organizations, and where there are resources that you can make use of, and use those resources for your own benefit, but also how you collaborate across all those dimensions and all those organizations. And that collaboration is what you can use to advance your career, because knowing people in lots of different settings means you're able to do a better job of getting your work published, of finding the resources to get time off so you can have the time to write, and get the publications out there, the time to think and reflect. The CASPAS is a wonderful setting for that thinking and reflection. And for years I assumed I knew what it was, which was that it was an association or a center that only the most senior of social science scholars would be accepted. They've changed it. Margaret Levy's been director, a political scientist who was president of APSA in 2005, I think. And she's opened it up a bit. So the cohort that I'm with, there are a lot of people who are younger than I would have thought. I had a visitor from my an IPSA meeting last week, Yuko Kasuya, who's a Japanese political scientist, and she said, well, I thought this was a place where the most seniors, these seem to be pretty young. I said, yeah, they are. Meaning they're associate professors and young full professors. But you make an assumption that you can't join that group. So I didn't apply until this past year. Yes, I got accepted, but maybe I should have applied 8 years ago. I don't know. But it might not have worked then. So broadening your experience, broadening your organizational experience as a young scholar is probably the most important thing you can do. I think my own career has been benefited by being able to be involved in the American Political Science Association, the Midwest Association, NCOPS, all of those things. You use them against each other and with each other, and it allows you to move up, even if you're not planning to. People begin to pull you in ways that you don't expect. So my advice to younger scholars is learn as much as you can about the organizational environment within which you can function. Organizational being academic, universities, organizations, domestic and international.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Pinder-Hughes. This concludes the interview questions, unless there's anything else that you would like to add.
Well, I'd just like to thank you, Dr. Mealy, for starting another generation of these kinds of interviews, because, of course, there was an earlier generation of Black political scientists interviewed, of which they're based at the University of Kentucky Library, and they're really remarkable kinds of documentation about the lives of the first generation of African American political scientists that we're lucky to have. So here I am, another generation.
Yes, you are indeed, and thank you so much for your participation.